You're watching the first lesson on percents. In this lesson, we'll be reviewing what you should already know. You should know what a percent is already. You should know that percents mean something and they represent a proportion. We've talked about percents in the first unit of grade 7 review, and we also talked about percents in probability as well as proportional reasoning. So this unit should not really be that difficult to you, and it should be more of a review. So we'll be going relatively quick through this unit because, again, percentages is something you've come across many times since grade 6, and we've come across it a couple of times in this year. So let's start with, what is a percent? Well, as you should know, a percent is always out of 100. So if someone says 10%, 25%, or 50%, they're saying 10 out of 100, right? They're saying 10 out of 100. So 10, 25, 50, they're saying that out of 100. And it's in the name, right? You can see per, which means out of, cent, or centi, which is 100. So when you say percent, it is out of 100. 10%, 10 out of 100. So this is just another visualization in text form that we can see that 25% means 25 out of 100, 34% means 34 out of 100, and 50% means 50 out of 100. What's another way of saying 25 out of 100 in math? So if I said, oh, you earned 25 out of your $100, well, you could also say this as a fraction, right? You can say 25 out of 100. So you can write percentages, so 25 out of 100 is the same as saying 25%, right? It's 25%. But you can also turn that into a fraction. Is there something else you can turn this into? Well, again, hopefully you remember this. You can also turn fractions into decimals, right? 25 out of 100 is the same as saying 0.25. So all three of these numbers, all three of these ways of showing this proportion represent the same amount or the same proportion, right? We have 25%, 25 out of 100, and 0.25. All three of these represent the exact same thing. So if I said you earned 25 out of $100, I can also say you've earned 25% of the money you earn, out of 25% of the total money you could get. As a fraction, you've earned 25 out of $100, basically saying the same thing. Or you could also say you've earned 0.25 of the total amount of money you could get. And so all three of these represent the exact same thing. So, quick review. If we had a grid of 100 squares, so we have 100 squares on this grid, color in 32% of the grid. So it's 100 squares, right? Well, a percent is always out of 100. So I'm not going to color these in, that'll take too much time, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So each row is 10, so we go 1, 2, 3, so that's our 30, and then we just color in 2, right? And that's roughly 32% of the grid because it's out of 100. So 32% of 100 is 32. Makes sense. 72, same thing again. We could even go this way because this is a square. So 72%, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's 70. We go 72. And so we have 72% of the grid colored in because it's 100 squares and percentages is always out of 100. So 72% of 100 is 72. So then that leads us to the next section. What if we didn't have 100? What if the total we had was not 100? In this case, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 across. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we have 5 down, 10 across. We multiply that. That gives us a total of 50 squares. Well, 50 is not 100. So how do I represent 32%? Because 32% is out of 100. Well, we can do this mathematically, right? And if you remember from proportional reasoning, you could write this out as a cross-multiply kind of question. So we have 50 squares in total, right? That's the total. So I'm going to draw this fraction It's a total of 50. We're trying to look for 32% of the grid. So you're trying to find out how many squares do we need to color. So that's what we're looking for. Well, this amount must equal 32%. Well, I'm using fractions here. Well, 32% is the same as saying 32 out of 100. Oh, it's just like proportional reasoning, right? So we've turned 50 into 100 in this case, right? Sorry, let me just do the code the other way. It'll be easier this way. So in this case, I'm trying to find out 100 turns into 50. Well, to turn 150, I could just go divide it by 2, right? If I divide 100 by 2, I get 50. Well, if I do that to the bottom, whatever I do to the bottom, I must do to the top, right? And so we divide that by 2. Well, 32 divided by 2, that question mark must equal 16. And if you put that into a calculator, you'll see that 16 is 32% of 50. So, 32% of 50. So I color in 16 squares. So that's 5, 10, 15, boom. And that's it. And that's how you would show your work, right? I don't want to see you just coloring it in right away and saying, oh, well, that's the answer. You could be right. But I want you to show me you understand how to convert one set of numbers into another, converting 32 out of 100, 32% into a number out of 50, right? That shows me you understand proportions. It shows me you understand percentages. Same thing can be applied here. We have 72% of the grid, right? We need to color in 72% of the grid. Okay, well, again, the total is 50. And we are looking for a number that represents the same as 72 out of 100. Again, I'm turning 100 into 50. So again, I divide it by 2. Whatever I do to the bottom, I do to the top. And that's it. That's all I got to do. So once you know how to turn the bottoms into each other, you do the exact same thing you did for the top. Right? And so 72 divided by 2 is 36. So that's as many as I need to color. So I go 1, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 36. And that's 72% of a grid with 50 squares, right? So that's how you convert percentages into values that aren't out of 100, because 36 out of 50, 36 out of 50 is the exact same representation as 72% or 72 out of 100. So this also equals 72%. This also equals 0.72. So this is just a walkthrough of how to do it, right? Each square represents 1%. Well, what percent should each square be worth when we add up to 100, right? So this is another way to visualize it. If we have 100 squares and a percentage is always out of 100, well, one square represents 1%. So every time I color in a square, I've colored in 1%. With this one, you have 50 squares. Well, what should each square add it up to? So all the squares need to add up to 100 because, again, a percent is always out of 100. Right? So if 100 squares, each percent is 100, I can add up all the squares to 100%. In this case, I have 50 squares. But if I add up the percentage of the value of each square, it must also add up to 100. So if I made each square 1%, well, that doesn't work because if I add up all the squares, it's not 100. So then I would say, okay, let's make this 2%. Well, if I made all the squares worth 2% and I added up all the squares, you would end up with 100%. So now you know that each square colored in is a value of 2%. So each square in the grid has a value of 2%. So 32% of the grid should be how many squares, and so on and so forth. So we've already solved this question, so we'll keep going. So when you have an amount that is not 100 and you are trying to find the percent, you need to value each part so that the total parts equal 100. So again, here we have 50 squares. Well, each part, each square, needs to be given a value. Well, I gave each square, a value of 2. And so they add up to 100. That's another way you could solve it. Right? Well, what happens if you have more than 125, more than 100%? In this case, 125%. What do you do then? Right? You may ask yourself, well, I thought percentages were always out of 100. You're right. Percentages are always out of 100. We usually use to represent values or proportions greater than 100% to say we've gotten more than the maximum or more than what is expected. Right? So what happens when you have more than 100%? So for example, 125%. Well, in this case, we need more than one grid, right? So again, we have two grids. Both of them have an amount of squares equal to 100. So that means each square represents 1%. Well, if each square represents 1%, I can color in. I'm just going to do this horrible zigzag to represent coloring in. Oops. Oh, there we go. I'm going to use this horrible zigzag to represent 100%. So that's 100%. And now I need to represent 25. So I can just go 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's 125. You color that in. And 125%, right? So you just color in a full set, right? This is one set, or 100%. And this is 25%. Right? So we use two 100 grids, just like before. So this is a relatively short video just to show you what percents were, how to calculate them, how to find them, and how to get percentages of values that don't go up to 100%. So do these questions. This will be good review, and I'll see you next lesson.